Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for coming out on this Saturday morning. And I'm the Climate Smart Coordinator for Philipstown. And if you've never heard of the Climate Smart Philipstown, that's totally fine. We are basically a task force for the town of Philipstown, and we are basically working on trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in our community and also plan for future climate change. And we are a volunteer run task force, and you are more than welcome to join us. Catherine Siro Thompson is my co-presenter, and she is a master gardener with Cornell Cooperative Extension. She's also a Climate Smart Task Force member. And we are lucky to have Pamela Doan with us, who is also a Climate Smart Task Force member and a master gardener. And she writes garden articles. And at the end of our presentation, she's going to help talk a little bit about plants and the like where to purchase plants at the end of the presentation. So we will leave lots of time for questions at the end. If you put the questions in the chat, I probably won't read them until we get to the question and answer period, but rest assured we will leave like probably about 15 minutes for questions. So let's get started, and I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Here we go. Okay. So, finding climate change in our backyard. To change everything, we need everyone. So I'm just going to give a very, very brief, quick primer on climate change. I'm sure we all understand that it's real, it's happening, it's caused by us, and we can make a difference. But back in 2018, the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, gave us a deadline. We have 10 years to nearly halve our global emissions. We need to both stop producing our emissions, and we also need to sequester emissions. And that means we need to draw the carbon out of the atmosphere if we are to avoid the worst climate catastrophe. So when you hear the word carbon sequestration, we often think about trees, which are amazing at storing carbon. But there's another solution: the way we use our land. And I'm not talking about farmland, which actually is a huge piece of the carbon sequestration solution, but I'm talking about another land use, which is the lawn. In the US, it's estimated we have about 40 million acres cultivated in grass in our yards, athletic fields, and golf courses. Unfortunately, these pristine areas are often treated with chemicals and fertilizers and pesticides that harm our waterways and children and pets. And in the eyes of bees and butterflies, are basically useless deserts void of pollen and nectar sources. And what's more, the greenhouse gas emissions from mowing, along with fertilizers and pesticides production, watering, and leaf blowing, were found by University of California to be 4 times greater than the amount of carbon stored by grass. So in other words, a conventional lawn, like the one you see in the picture right here, it's producing more carbon dioxide than it absorbs. So I'm just going to say that again. A conventional lawn produces more carbon dioxide than it absorbs. So let's bring it closer to home. Here in Philipstown, we have 2,437 acres of developed open space. That's our golf courses, that's our parks, our recreation fields, and our lawns. So we have an opportunity to both stop producing emissions and also sequester them. But that means we need to tackle the perfect icon, the lawn. So what's wrong with the lawn? The lawn is a food desert. Lawns are monoculture. Monoculture means one type of plant. They don't feed bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, or birds. They're energy hogs. On average, lawns are mowed once a week. And then there's the double whammy of the pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides that have a high carbon cost and also harm wildlife and water bodies. So it's time to redefine what the perfect lawn means. Is it, is the goal to have just a lush, green, short, non-natural thing, or do we want to maybe redefine what a lawn does? And I'm not at all here to say rip up your lawn, because I have 2 kids and I know how much they love playing around on green space. But we can think about how we use our lawn and what practices we do. So the other thing we should be thinking about is that below the surface of the lawn is soil, and the soil is alive. And we need to be thinking about how to feed the soil first. So if you peel back the layer of your grass, what you'll find below is life. And I'm gonna just do a distinction between dirt and soil. Dirt could be sand, clay, minerals, rocks. Soil is literally teeming with life. A tablespoon of soil contains 1 billion microbes. These tiny microbes, the bacteria, the fungi, the proteus, they are the movers and shakers of carbon sequestration. They transform organic matter from plants and animals into soil organic carbon, a process that builds soil fertility and draws carbon from the atmosphere and locks it away. So how does that happen? So I'm just going to give a very quick science lesson. Our plants inhale the carbon dioxide. They use that to power photosynthesis. But the plants don't use every ounce of carbon they capture for their own growth. The extra carbon seeps into the roots as exudates. And that secretion then feeds the hungry soil microbes. Having more carbon in the soil is transformative. It means better infiltration, water infiltration, higher nutrient and water retention. And the other thing that's super important is that plant community, a diverse plant community, meaning more than just one plant type, delivers a greater variety of carbon exudates through their roots, feeding a rich patchwork of microbes. So the real takeaway here is healthy soil have lots of microbes equals more carbon sequestration. So if healthy soil is the goal, how do we get there? These are just a few ways that we can manage our lawns. When we mow the lawn, we leave the grass clippings on the lawn to return nitrogen to the soil. We can plant white clover seeds in the lawn. Clover provides nitrogen to the soil and flower resources for pollinators. And we can top dress the lawn with a fine layer of compost or compost tea that will help feed the soil bacteria. Another thing is that if the goal is, again, to have a healthy lawn, we need to stop using synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides, because this will essentially kill the microbes that are integral to the ecosystem. And also, the secondary effect is that it's very impactful to wildlife. Catherine will later touch about the effect on pollinators, but pesticides are a major factor in the insect apocalypse because they kill beneficial insects. And just a little, fun fact is that 48% of Philipstown residents don't use fertilizers, herbicides, or pesticides on their lawn. So this is actually a really great solution. Like, who likes to mow their lawn anyways? So let's mow less or don't mow at all. You could just mow the lawn every 2 to 3 weeks or let it grow to about 4 inches. And you'll get more bees, a wider variety of bee species. And keeping the grass longer encourages growth of root systems, making your lawn more resilient to drought and other stressors and keep weeds out. Or you can just leave a section to go wild, and you may end up finding a number of wildflowers coming through. And you can intentionally add some native plants to it. just make sure if there's any invasive plants that pop up to pull them out. And in the fall, you can, instead of using a leaf blower and bagging up those leaves, leave the leaves on the lawn and mulch mow them, which will break up the little leaves into tiny pieces and will end up putting nutrients back into the soil. And again, less work for you. So let's talk lawn equipment. So a dirty little secret is that the EPA estimates that about 17 million gallons of gasoline are spilled every year in the country just filling the lawnmowers. And lawnmowers emit 10 times more hydrocarbons than a typical car for every operation. So an example is like driving a Camry, a 2017 Camry for 300 miles is equivalent to using a lawnmower for 1 hour. Backpack leaf blowers produce as much carbon in 1 hour as driving a car for 8 hours.
Whoa.
Yes. There's not as much strict regulation on emissions for your lawnmower and leaf blower equipment. So what can you do? You can switch out the gas-powered mowers, blowers, chainsaws, hedge trimmers, and other yard equipment for electric. Electric equipment is actually cheaper to operate because it runs on battery and not gasoline, easier to maintain because it doesn't require tune-ups, oil, or spark plug replacements. And the noise of many gas-powered mowers and blowers can cause hearing damage to operator because it's just so loud. And I'm going to show you my really low budget video that I made yesterday of me using my electric lawnmower. All right.
Hey everyone, I'm just going to show you my Ego Power electric lawnmower. This is the battery that I popped out of the charger, and I'm going to stick it in the lawnmower. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to use and quiet.
All right, very low budget, but it just goes to show you how simple it is to use the electric lawnmower. That battery that I put in, I have a charger in the garage, and I'll pop it out and just place it in the charger if I'm done. I have about 2,000 square feet of backyard that I mow. It takes me about a half an hour. And the battery lasts the whole charge, and I still have battery power left afterwards. And this is a lawnmower that we bought at Home Depot, and it's not self-propelled. So it's like one of the cheaper versions. I think we spent about $400 on it. And the battery in this lawnmower also is usable in our weed whacker. So it's interchangeable. And so I have to say, I'm a total convert. I would never have mowed the lawn. You couldn't have paid me to mow our lawn before, but with the electric lawnmower, I actually enjoy it. I've listened to music, or like I'll listen to podcasts when I mow, and it's just something I don't mind doing anymore. And oops, no, you don't want to see me again. Sorry about that. And let's go to the next one. And so the last thing before I turn it over to Catherine is that you could always find an area of your yard that you don't mind converting into a flower or pollinator garden. So this is an example of my house. And on the left-hand side, that's a sloped area that was really not fun to mow. It's hard, it's hard mowing across the hill. So I identified that as a place that I could shrink my lawn. And I put in a bunch of plugs, specifically a mix to attract pollinators. And on the right-hand side, that's what my my lawn looked like in the fall. So, and that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, who is going to talk about the second half of our program.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Crystal, for all this information. I see in the chat box that somebody is asking about opposing views to chemical fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, killing microbes or not killing microbes. I've not personally heard that synthetic fertilizer were beneficial to the microbiome. So that's a new one on me. I'm going to check on this. That's my answer to that. So I also want to say that I'm going to turn myself off, because looking at myself and looking at you guys, I get very distracted. So that's out of the question. And also, I have a brand new puppy in my house. So if you hear a lot of barking, and I'll try to keep that quiet, that's because he is nervous about something. So I figured I would let you know ahead of time. So we're going to speak about how to bring nature in your home and how to do sustainable landscaping. I'm going to preamble this by letting one of our most famous entomologists speak, Doug Tallamy. And next slide, please. And if you can just start it, thank you so much. You'll find this quite enlightening, and I'll meet you on the other side of this. Can we hear it? Not sure we can hear it.
No.
Okay. Maybe you want to turn your volume further up, and yeah, because your volume is down. You see that little volume on the side? Yeah, on the right hand. Yeah, just right there. Bring it all the way up and then start it again. Oops. You muted it again. Oh, okay. There's a delay.
Oh, I think it's maybe because I put myself on mute. Sorry. Can you hear it?
That's right. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
The ability for ecosystems to function in our managed landscapes, in our suburban urban matrix, is very poor, because we have landscape primarily for looks. We've treated plants as if they were decorations and forgotten all about their ecological roles. So we've sacrificed the ability of all of the land that we've used for our suburban neighborhoods to make ecosystem services that not only support other creatures, but they support us as well. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing the research we're doing. We're trying to generate enough data to convince people that these landscapes can be highly productive. If you produce plants that insects cannot reproduce on and develop on, you are creating a really depauperate ecosystem. What this homeowner has done is put the plants back into this suburban landscape. Most of these plants are indigenous. They are native to this area, which means they are important components of the food webs that originally were in this area. So you have lots of wildlife around, and these plants are filtering our water. They are sequestering carbon. They're supporting food webs. They are supporting the pollinators that keep those plants around. They're producing oxygen. All of the ecosystem services that plants provide are now happening right in this yard, because it's not one vast lawn. When I think of best plants, I think of what those plants are doing. And in almost every instance, oaks come out on top. In our region of the country, the mid-Atlantic states, oaks support 534 species of caterpillars. And remember, the birds are eating those caterpillars. So that's 534 species of bird food coming from the oak in your front yard. There's no other tree that does it better. Just for comparison's sake, if you had a ginkgo in your yard, which is from Asia, it supports one species of caterpillar. So there's a huge difference in the productivity of these particular trees. I care about this because we need these other living things to run the ecosystems that we depend on as humans. So we can think of this as, we're not making a sacrifice here. We are doing what's absolutely necessary to keep the ecosystems running that support us. So it's for humans.
Right, pretty edifying. I thought this was really a great presentation, a great preamble to speaking about climate change and habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and the threats to our ecosystem, starting with the threats to pollinators. So in our developed countries, the pollinators, as we know, are in really steep decline through habitat loss, through disease, through pesticide use. But these are the immediate threats, but overlaying everything is climate change and the consequences of which may unravel the very fabric of our environment. And while it's harder to study insects on a global scale, experts say that in some regions, more than 40% of invertebrate pollinator species are threatened with extinction. So that's the bees, that's the moth, that's the butterflies, the beetles, etc., etc. Takes, for example, the, the monarch butterfly. And we think of pesticide and loss of habitat as reasons for the monarch decline. But the Xerxes Society established that the more frequent and severe droughts caused by climate change are believed to be the primary reasons for the decimation of the butterfly population. So how can we help them? Well, monarch butterflies need forage to feed on prior to their departure from our areas, and as well as en route, of course, to their Mexican Sierra Madre forest destination. I don't know if any of you have been in the Michoacan area in Mexico, but it's just a sight to behold when you see all of these monarchs on the trees. So if they lack forage through habitat loss or through habitat fragmentation, or if, for instance, there are huge rainstorms or violent winds, that knocks them out while they're underway, and then they just won't make it to their nesting sites. So even though they do nest other places than just down in the Sierra Madre. So it's important we keep late blooming flowers in our pollinator gardens so that we feed them before they go, they're satiated, we give them the best chance to undertake this long journey. And it's also important to keep native plants in your garden that pollinators can recognize. So next slide, please. I wanted to say a word about habitat loss and fragmentation. The human-dominated landscapes are the most rapidly expanding. I'm sure in our lifetime we've all noticed that. They're also the least understood ecosystem on Earth. We have a tendency to alter the landscape quite a bit through land development, through land artificialization in urban settings, for instance, but also industrial agriculture, you know, intensive farming methods. These create habitat fragmentation, particularly through monocultures that are not allowing for diversified pollinator groups to survive, right? So it's a big loss of biodiversity. Just to give you an idea, between 2008 and 2012, we converted 7 million acres in our country. And so that's that much fragmentation of wild spaces. They were converted to cropland. And as you know, wheat and corn don't provide the pollen and the nectar that are necessary for the bees to feed on. Also, another reason for habitat loss and fragmentation is ever increasing roadways building and the parking lot and the shopping malls. That's just a further fragmented view of the landscape. And then remember that the food webs are the basis, of course, for the ecosystem, and the pollinators are part of them. And the insect population is the least resilient group of pollinators. So as such, they're really at the greatest risk. And of course, you know, it's always painful to watch a bird eating a butterfly or a bee, but every creature in this food web must eat, and that includes us. So we have to take care of this. And to be more specific about habitat fragmentation, I'm going to give you a little metaphor. Imagine the stepping stones in a garden pathway, yeah? Each being a population of pollinators and their food sources together, right? Then imagine removing every other stone, The populations of pollinators are farther and farther to travel to find food and mates, right? And then not all the pollinators are created equal. They don't all travel the same distances. So some live just a few hundred feet from their nest, but others will venture a little further, like the bumblebees. They'll go like a mile away. Honeybees even more so. The butterfly and the birds, of course, have extraordinary travels. But so now, remove another set of alternating stones, and then the populations are so far apart at this point that insects may stick only to their little stepping stone patch. They won't go anywhere else because there's nowhere else to go. And then if something happens, like for instance, a housing development or a parking lot being built or something, those pollinators have no nearby stepping stones to move, and so they'll perish. So the remaining wild areas are few. That's the point I'm trying to drive. And the urban and suburban land have to become the next pollinators' habitats or refuge. So planting a pollinator garden and convincing your neighbors to do the same is just paramount. Right. The TV naturalist David Michowinski said that creating a wildlife habitat is more than just planting a pretty garden. It's actually restoring one small piece of the ecosystem. Now, wouldn't that feel good, right? So urban and suburban backyards can provide excellent habitat for native and managed bees population, especially if those backyards are near or attached to one another, like in the pollinator pathways. You can add pollinator-friendly garden signs to your yards when you're part of the pollinator pathways. Some are available at the Putnam Pollinator Pathway. Some are available also at the Pollinator Partnership, the Monarch Watch, the Xerxes Society, whichever one you decide to belong to, you will do good. And then these are signs of your commitments, and they may create, when you have them in your garden, they create an opportunity to talk to your neighbors about offering food and water and shelter for the pollinators. And then the more backyards and parks we connect, the greater the abundance and diversity pollinators we support. So I think this is a worthwhile goal. Next slide, please. Just a quick word about climate change, the big CCs. There's still much to learn about the potential impacts, but currently the science suggests that many species will not be able to respond to warmer temperatures fast enough, and they will go extinct. As we know, ecosystems cannot function without the insects, and that, as I was saying before, they're the most sensitive group. So the climate change will make almost half the insect habitat unsuitable by the end of the century, with the pollinators, such as bees, particularly affected. So this is really a very short call. The rate of change is predicted to be too fast for the bees and the butterflies to adapt. But most of all, the extreme weathers, the long periods of droughts, the extreme heat amplified in the urban settings as what we call heat islands will really make it difficult for the insects to survive. So you know that 25% of the solar radiation is transferred back through transpiration. So if we plant enough patches of native plants throughout the urban settings, it'll help cool the city and provide habitat for the pollinators. So it's not only in more natural areas such as ours that we have to step up and do the right thing. We also have to help our urban settings through container gardening, for instance, right? Another issue of the climate change is that the once synchronized timing of blooming time and insect emergence is becoming less reliable. Think, for instance, of periods of early spring warmth. The plants are blooming, but then all of a sudden you have a short, deep freeze. We just had some warm weather yesterday and the day before. Then all of a sudden we might just have a snowfall and a deep freeze, and all the blooms die, right? And the insect emerge, and then they have no food. So for this, we want to make sure that we have overlapping succession of blooms, but most of all, very, very early bloomers. And perhaps you want to leave the dandelions in your lawn because they are a great source. They're one of the first quote unquote weeds, as a judgment call will call them. But they're a great source for the pollinators to feed on, as well as the animals, as a matter of fact. So next slide, please. So talking about the pollinators, it's as if I haven't driven the point strong enough. Is how important are they? Well, they do a lot. They basically maintain our ecosystem around the world. They sustain the plants that provide the food and the shelter for people and wildlife, right? And the plants that provide medicines for people and animals. And they sustain very diverse and healthy landscape. I mean, from desert to forest. The native bees in our alone provide about 5 billion in crop pollination services every year in our country. So yeah, they're working hard. One Kenyan entomologist named Dino Martin was saying, and I kept that phrase because I thought it was just so relevant. He said, if you can spend 5 minutes a day in the company of an insect, your life will never be the same. So just sit down, take a breather, and look at them. It's edifying, you know. Pollinators are the difference between the future we want and the one we fear. They're the smallest thing, but they have the most impact. So next slide, please. And it's certainly impacting our food landscape, our foraging habits. If you're looking at whole food right up there, on the right-hand side, the food choices would be very limited without the action of pollinators, right? The bees or their absence would wipe out coffee and apples and almonds and tomatoes. And well, although tomatoes do self-fertilize, but they are helped by the pollinators too. But cocoa, for instance, if you're a chocolate lover, just to name a few, right? All of these are crops that rely on pollination. And we as humans rely on a well-functioning ecosystem for food and for our own survival, from the agriculture land to our supermarket shelves. Next slide, please. And the plants and the pollinators have co-evolved on the planet in a relationship of mutual benefit that is a long, long story of symbiosis, 130 million old story, as a matter of fact, long before we were on the planet. And without the animals, plants could not set seed, they could not reproduce, and without the plants, the animal population would decline too. So yes, pollinators are really important, and they're important for our birds, for instance, as well. Next slide, please. They are the base of the food chain. I think the entomologist Doug Tallamy that we just saw in the video clip before was saying that he sat once for an entire springtime, well, I guess not night and day, but he posited that by looking at a couple of chickadees going back and forth to feed their young, they had to find about 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of young. So you can see how important the presence of the insect is in larvae, etc. And then the reason is that pound for pound, the insect contains more protein than beef or fish. Hint, hints, qu'on se le dise, as we say in French, be advised, you know, these might be the next sorts of protein for us humans as well. But for the birds, 96% of the North American land birds feed their young with insects. So it's important that they're still there. And of course, the importance of the native plants in our landscape is paramount, because the insects feed on the plant that they know, the ones that they've co-evolved with. So with increasing non-native plants, the food buffet is really shrinking for the insects. there is a case for stating that some of the non-native plants are becoming food for the insects as well, and that's true. But in a general fashion, these plants come without their predators, so they look wonderful, and they definitely thrive well, but they do not provide a lot of food for our pollinators. So next slide. What do native gardens have to look like? Well, they could look like this. You could start at the beginning of the season. I would say if you're turning over a piece of your lawn, start in the fall, put some cardboard down on the area that you want to plant, and let nature be. Let the grass become the biomass and the dirt, the soil rather. And in the spring, just open it up, lift it up, and start planting. And you can just use plugs. They're easier, they're more economical, they're easier to plant. Mulch your area. You can use dry grass if you still have some, or dry shredded leaf, etc., etc. Water your plugs, and before you plant them, and once they're planted. There's a big shock for them otherwise. Next slide, please. So what do pollinators need? Well, they need nectar, pollen, that's the obvious. They need also shelter ahead of ahead of nesting site. So how do you supply this continuously? So we're going to approach this in our next slide. So, all right, this was, we're a little bit behind here, I'm sorry. So let's go to the native garden design. Next slide. Yep, you'll see that I'm waiting for the next slide to come on. Yeah, that's it. So this is the result of the plan that we looked at before, which had Joe Pine, which had mountain mint and blue aster, etc. So after you've planted all of this in the spring, voila, there comes the result of your design. It's only one example; it doesn't have to be this, but there are many different examples of this that you can find online. We'll give you a lot of information about this, so not to worry, you don't have to rely on your own creativity. Next slide, please. So I was just saying before, what do pollinators need? So we spoke about this too. Don't forget about the water, because pollinators cannot survive without it. Make sure it's not too deep. Next slide, please. What is important in the foraging? Well, it's important to have early bloomers as well as very late bloomers. So mix them up. The early bloomers are very often the native trees, and the shrubs are the earliest bloomers that provide the food for the first emerging insects. Think about the oaks. Think about the witch hazels, the redbuds, think about the cherry trees, the plums, the willow. The pussy willows are huge early bloomers, the spice bushes, etc. And then the spring flowers, the bloodroot, the hellebore. You know, if you have them in your garden, they're already in bloom. The bluebells, the Dutchman britches, etc. Then the summer flowers, the tiger lilies, the lobelias, the milkweeds, houseplants, right? Hyssops. I mean, so many. This is really not the subject for our presentation today, and we could go on and on and on. Don't forget about the late bloomers, the monardas, the asters, and the goldenrods that are, so wonderful together. This yellow and the purple, the joe pies, the sunflowers, etc., etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. You can see, for instance, the hellebore on the left here. That's for the spring bloomer, but then the boneset, the common boneset, is really a very pretty one. I showed you one in bloom and then one in the fall when they're in seeds. And the mountain mint to the right, which is great. It blooms from June through August, so it's a long-lasting one. And so all of this is nectar for the insect and for the birds. Next slide, please. What's very important is to allow diversity in your garden. So a mixture of plants that with diversified characteristics that cater to the different types of pollinators that you have. We know that also with many different plant species, you'll have more resistance to pests and diseases. And then also the pollinators will come at different times of the season, of the day and the night also. So they require the nectar and the energy, etc. For the, excuse me, the nectar for the energy and the pollen for the protein. And as larvae, they also need to feed on host plants. So don't forget about the milkweed and the butterfly weed. Also, planting in clusters is really good. It creates a target for the pollinators to find. They also say to plant in 12. That's really tough. They say have at least 12 plants of 12 different plant species blooming at the same time. So I'll say, do what you can, do your best, even if it's 3 and 3, it's fine. Avoid the native cultivars because they have been cultivated for traits that may be pleasing to our eyes, but they're really hindrance to the pollinators, like the double petals, etc., etc. Next slide, please. So don't forget about the water. I was saying water is life and none of us can live without it. Next slide, please. Don't forget about the shelters. Incorporate different canopy layers in the landscape by planting trees and shrubs and different sized perennial plants and group plantings so that the pollinators can move safely through the landscape and they protect it from predators. Next slide, please. Don't forget about hedges. They provide shelter from wind and they make natural windbreak that are much nicer to look at as a boundary than fences or walls. And so they're much better for the wildlife. And of course, use native trees and shrubs, right? Next slide, please. As far as insects are concerned, you need to give them a place to raise their young. So be sure to keep some debris and brushes and logs left over for them to have nesting sites. Just remember that 70% of our native bees are solitary and they nest in the ground. So they need these bare spots. 30% of them are tunnel nesting, like the mason bees, for instance, or the leafcutter bees, and they nest in wood cavities in the hollow stems. So if you leave all of these hollow stem and peathy stems up during the entire winter, then it's wonderful because here is their overwintering place and their nesting place come spring. So don't disturb your landscape too much. Just we tend to do this. We want to keep tidy, but it's good to leave a lot of places for them to grow and to overwinter and to feed their youngs. Remember that in the spring you want to wait at least for a full week of 60-degree consistent weather, so that you don't scoop them up while trying to be tidy, right? So by the time a week has gone of 60 degrees, they'll have flown off and on they go to their new life. Next slide, please. This is a few design tenets. It's good to, when you design a pollinator planting, consider the overall landscape and how the new habitat is going to function. Focus on the specifics of the planting, such as the species diversity and the bloom time, the plant density, etc., etc. Think in 3 dimensions, think like nature does. Nature doesn't like vacuum, so you don't either. And then also introduce the concept of time in your design. Think about what your garden is going to look like in 5 to 10 years and the space each tier needs. And the overall result that you want to envision. Next slide, please. So a few more tenets. The plant repetition is good. A single plant species being repeated throughout the garden. It creates a visual tie. Also, it serves the pollinator best. And they don't just return to one grouping or of liked source nectar. They just move on. So they will hop from one grouping to the next, right? So next slide, please. I just want to say that bloom charts are a great help for you to select your plants. There's plenty of these plants out there. We can't have them all, but you can use these resources to decide and discern what can best work for you. Next slide, please. And this information will be available in the information that we're going to send you through email. Trees and shrubs, same thing. Here are some blooming charts for your trees and shrubs, of native ones, of course. Next slide, please. And consider joining the pollinator pathway. You'll be a part of the growing network of pollinator gardens in our county, and show your support and talk to your neighbor about it. And with this, I will relinquish the microphone to Pam. Thank you so much for listening.
If you're there, Pam, and you'd like to help kind of go over some good sources for plants, I think that's the number one challenge, is that you're like, yeah, I'm on board, but now where do I go? Right?
Sure. Hi, I'm Pamela Doan. There's a great list here of sources to buy plants. I also wanted to just throw something in here, because I've been working in this area around climate change and native plants and dealing with invasive species for about 11 years, and a lot of experience with them. While the photos in here, I just want to manage expectations a tiny bit, because all the photos that were used in this presentation were gorgeous. And these are amazing gardens. And even Doug Tallamy's presentation focusing on Rick Dark's garden. These are really, these are some of the biggest landscapes in the world, like in the country at least. So these are very people with a lot of experience, people who have a lot of time and money to put into these gardens, and they are lifelong experiences. This is not something that you're expected to create in your own yard this summer. The other thing to know about native plants is because you walk into, and this is also a good thing to know about shopping for native plants, is that when you walk into a traditional landscape nursery, you're going to see lots of things in bloom. There's going to be a lot of color. There's going to be a lot of bright things, shiny things to look at. And native plants don't necessarily work that way. Annuals that are bred to do their full bloom in one season are bred in greenhouses. They are shipped all around the world. They are showing up on the shelves at a peak time for when they're in bloom and looking great. So native plants don't really work that way. They don't bloom well when they're in containers, honestly. If you walk into a native plant nursery, you might see some green. If you were looking for an aster in May, an aster blooms in the fall. So what you're going to see is a plant that might be this big and it's not going to have any flowers on it. And it might look a little sad, honestly. But that plant, when you get it into your garden, is going to be able to grow and it's going to be able to bloom in the fall. But you're going to have a very different experience in shopping for native plants than you would in shopping for annuals or cultivated perennials. They just have there's a whole different approach to breeding them and selling them. And also the thing with native plants is that it usually takes 3 years to get maximum bloom and for everything to work for this plant. So the first season you're going to put your plants in, they're going to look okay, especially if they're plugs. They're going to be very small. If you put in plugs that usually bloom in spring, you're not going to see them do anything. If you put in plugs in the summer that bloom in the fall, you might get a few flowers, but probably not. Your second season, you're going to have really cool results. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to be, everything will be blooming. It'll be interesting. And then your third season, you're going to see full on glory of everything that you started 3 years ago. So this is also a labor of patience when you're thinking about planting this way. it is not something that it has an immediate gratification. Just so you understand like what you're what you're getting into. And it's amazing. The best thing about planting with native plants is that if you really let them move, you're going to have this dynamic, artful, interactive display year after year that will never be exactly the same. You could try to like battle against nature and make them look the same every year if you're really into that. And there are some plants that can be tamed more easily. But these are, you know, there's some wildness to this that is part of the grace and is part of the beauty of what you can experience. So here you'll see some of the different places where you can buy native plants. One Nature in Beacon, I worked with them for 3 years. It's an ecological design studio. They have a great selection of plants. Many of them are local ecotypes, which means that they are grown from seeds that have been harvested and cultivated here in the Hudson Valley. So they are really unique and personal for our growing conditions here and for our ecology. They have a garden center that's next to Binnacle Books in Beacon. A Putnam County seedling sale is going on right now. It's a great way to order in bulk. So you can get like 10 witch hazel seedlings. What you'll see is that these seedling trees and plants look like sticks with some roots. They're easy to plant. That's why I love them, especially when if you have like, you want to put 10 witch hazel trees around your woods. It will take you an hour to put them all in. If you have a 6-foot witch hazel that you want to plant in your yard, it's going to take you 3 hours to like dig through our rocky clay soil and install a tree. So this is a great way to have big impact in a very affordable way, because you'll also get 10 seedling trees for like $15 or $20. So it's a great way to get in there and do some stuff. And if you don't need them all, share them with your neighbors or friends. Ezel native plants, I'm actually not familiar with, Crystal. Is this the one that's across the river in Rockland?
It's actually, it's an online, they aggregate. So basically you can go in and buy trays, like 50 plugs.
Oh, okay.
And they source from like around Pennsylvania, New York. But it is native plants, and you can get 50. What I love is that you can get like the 50 plugs, which is great if you want to do
Sure.
very large planting for not very much money.
Okay. Manza is a nursery in the Catskills. I think it's actually in Kerhonkson. They grow their own plants there, so they have an ongoing change in inventory. They usually have a list on their website of what's available. Prairie Moon, New Moon, they're both available for online orders. Prairie Moon also, you can do like a mixed tray of plugs. I think you can do something like 50 plugs for $100 or something along that line. Rosedale is a very well-known native plant nursery in Westchester. Sabelico is a family-owned business in Hopewell Junction. Doesn't have exclusively native plants, but has a lot of choices there. The Native Plant Center in Westchester has a sale that's going on right now. You can order online and then you go pick them up, I think in early May or end of April. The Master Gardener plant sale in May, we always have an entire section of native plants and try to have a really good selection and a lot of information about how they work and what they're good for. I've worked on that section for many years now. Catskill Native Plant Nursery. And then the Healthy Yards Project has this May 2nd event. It's an Earth Day event in Bedford. Okay. So those, I'd also like to just throw in some like really high impact plants, because you did such a good job of covering this, Catherine. Like Doug Tellamy said, for example, the quercus, the oak trees, have over 500 different kinds of insects and caterpillars that they attract. The other one, so not everybody can have a towering oak in their yard though. But the salix species, which are willows. So pussy willow, black willow, there are some that grow well in on riverbanks and in wetter conditions. But the willows are really wonderful plants, wonderful shrubs that pretty much anyone could have in their yard. The milkweeds, of course, are really important. No milkweed, no monarchs is basically what's going on. I would say that so the common milkweed can become very almost weedy unless you're putting it into like a really nice mixed bed or something like that with other large flowers. It's gorgeous and it also smells really good. It's got this lovely fragrance, but it's not for everyone. The butterfly weed, which is orange, it's Asclepias tuberosa, is an awesome choice that could go in any mixed perennial landscape bed. The mints, if you have deer, deer will not eat your mints. So mints are a really high impact way to get a lot of flowers out there for pollinators without having to worry about deer problems. And then asters and goldenrod are two of the most important species for late fall foraging. Goldenrod are also maybe not for everyone because they seed heavily and will go everywhere. They're less easy to tame, but you can also cut off the seed heads at the end of the summer, and then once they finish blooming, and you can control the seeding a little better. Okay, let's get to questions.
Pam, and thank you so much. That is like so helpful to have your perspective. So I just want to if we leave you with anything that you remember at the end of this, is this graphic here on the left, which I love. It's less blowing, less mowing, and more growing. So if we can keep that in mind, it'll go a long way to helping us reverse the tide of our lawns being carbon emitters, which it just it's something that we can do right now in our backyard. So I know there was quite a few questions in the chat. If there's anyone who wants to ask a question right now, or we can go through the chat box.
Yeah, I see a few questions in the chat box, if I may.
Yeah.
One of the last ones is speak about the water to be supplying for the insects, and how should we begin with that? You could begin by leaving muddy areas, because butterflies, for instance, will just dig right into this with a proboscis, and they'll be able to extract the water out of there. But then if you leave some dishes, like the saucers that you have for plants, and you put some stones in it, and you put a little bit of water, you keep it nice and moist, that's enough for the bees. They'll just sit on the side, and they won't drown. So that's a pretty good way of doing it. And of course, water for the birds, but that you already know in bird feeders, and something that regenerates is best, of course. So that's one of the questions I wanted to answer.
We will definitely, after this, I'm going to send out a document with all of those plant sources that we just talked about, as well as some links to some really good websites, and also a couple of really good book recommendations. And that, and we even have like a little booklet that we found that gives different sample garden designs. There's a lot of really good information out there. Healthy Yards, from this graphic, they're a really good resource. Someone had asked how synthetic fertilizer could interfere, and I'm going to try to summarize it. And if I'm wrong, Catherine or Pamela, please correct me. But what happens is when you use synthetic fertilizers on grass, the roots are very shallow. And also there's a partnership between the plants and the microbes. And if the grass is getting all of their nutrients from the fertilizer, then they're like, I don't need you guys. And like the partnership kind of breaks apart, right? And so like the whole idea is that, we want the plant to take in that carbon, use it, release some of the carbon to the microbes, feed them, they take it in, they store it in the soil. You're kind of breaking that relationship when you're putting in this external synthetic fertilizer. And really the biggest key is that the roots are very shallow on like heavily fertilized grasses. So if I misspoke or said that wrong, please correct me, but that.
No, I think you're right. And then the whole, one of the big tenets is feed the soil, not the plants. So there's one thing to remember, that would be that.
I forgot to mention this, and if you use a landscaping service, they're going to want to show up and mow every single week, even in the summer when your grass is not growing, because you're paying them and they want to like show that your money is going somewhere. So in the summer months, when they come out and mow, when your grass doesn't even need it, they're now compacting the soil and wasting fuel. So that's maybe a discussion to have with your landscaper. Like, are you okay with just paying them for the season, but not showing up in the middle of the summer when your grass is not even growing? Are you okay with that? Those are things to maybe have a conversation with your landscaping company. And if you end up buying electric equipment, would they be comfortable with using your electric equipment instead of their very heavy, very carbon emitting intensive equipment that they have? So anyways, I'm going to leave it. If there's anyone who has a question, stick your hand up or unmute yourself, please fire away. Hi, David. Davis?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for this presentation. It was really informative and inspiring. All three of you, thank you. I'm interested in this particularly because I work at the Shakespeare Festival and we're being gifted half of what is now the Garrison golf course. And I just had no idea that the kinds of mowers that people use in their backyard, and I presume the kinds of industrial mowers that are used for maintaining a golf course, have that kind of carbon footprint. And I know that there are golf courses that are struggling and closing all over the country. So my question is, are you guys aware of other, and because of the acreage that are used for these golf developments, are you guys aware of other projects where golf courses are being rehabilitated or rewilded or turning into native meadows or native gardens? Are there precedent projects out there that we should be thinking about that other people on the call know about that I might not?
You might just be a pioneer.
You might be a pioneer. Yeah.
This is a case where a soil test would determine what's living in that soil now, and what kind of rehab it would need over time in order to be able to support other kinds of plants.
Mhm.
That would be the first step, would just to have a detailed soil test done. I could give you some resources about how to do that. It's also something where you might want to work with a landscape architect who could do a master plan that would be succession planting in different years to see how to best support the needs of the festival, and also to have a great ecological impact. That would be so cool. I see press in your future for this.
I was going to say, there's a documentary I highly recommend watching on Netflix. It's called Kiss the Ground, and it talks a lot about, specifically talking about farming and regenerative agriculture. And I see sheep in the future. Sheep and goats in the Hudson Valley Shakespeare future. Just throw on a bunch of animals, manage the grazing so we can get those nutrients back in the soil. And but it's a good documentary. I'll put that in resources.
And it's hopeful, which
Yeah, it's still the question though of how many chemicals were put into that soil, and if you would even want animals to graze on it.
That's true.
That is the big one. You'd want to know what you're getting into first. So looking at the chat, there was a question about bird feeders. I'm not any guidance. Bird feeders don't cause harm. There's never been any research that has said that feeding birds somehow makes them dependent on humans or something like that. It's really useful during the winter and in times of really challenging weather conditions, for birds to have a supplemental source. The main guidance for our area, though, is to watch out for wildlife, where you are creating conditions where you're going to attract a bear into your yard that could become a nuisance somewhere else, and then would ultimately possibly need to be killed, because we have put our bird feeders out at inappropriate times and attracted them into our yards, and then caused interactions that will ultimately harm the bear. So the main thing is, if you are feeding birds, any kind of feeders, during the season when bears are active, you need to take them down at night. And if you can do it during the winter, during the harshest conditions, that's awesome. Another way to do it is just to plant some bird habitat in your yard. You know, have these trees and have all these wonderful plants that have lots of insects on them, so that birds can feed their babies and feed themselves, and you'll see lots of birds in your yard. That's a great thing to do. But there's nothing inherently bad about them. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. I wanted to add to this that bird feeder do have a tendency to attract rodents in the way of white-footed mice, particularly, or chipmunks, because they just love the free food. So yes, maintaining a little bit the area where the seeds fall is good, because you're not feeding everybody. I mean, you're just feeding the birds. That's a good thing to do. Just monitor this. I know personally, last year, with the explosion of chipmunks, I had families upon families of chipmunks that just decided to settle right around the area of my bird feeder. And I just realized that I had left the bird feeder a little too long in the season. So May is, you'll see the chipmunks coming around. So just be aware of that.
I just wanted to address one of the questions I saw in the chat about what to do for tick control. So I think there are a few options. You could put out where they're called like tick boxes is an option, or if there is a specific area that you like to hang out or your kids play, you know, you can keep that section like mowed shorter. And also, I mean, we all live in the woods, so we kind of have to do the tick check thing no matter what. You could be sitting on your back deck with nothing in sight and still have a tick crawl on you. That's unfortunately the reality of living where we live. But yeah, so tick boxes, and you know, you can mow a little bit closer in sections that you are particularly you use heavily. I don't know if there's if you have another suggestion, Pamela or Catherine.
The other thing that really is a problem for the tick populations in our area is Japanese barberry. Research has shown that it is a perfect host plant, creates amazing habitat for ticks. So getting rid of some of your Japanese barberry is always a good thing to do, and just trying to control that in your yard.
And if they old, good luck. Arm yourself with lots of elbow oil. Also, creating a boundary between your lawn and your wooded area is good. You can add a big layer of wood chips, for instance, or stones, or something that stops that traveling possibility for the ticks. From because they don't jump, they just walk, but they'll walk on grass. So if you have a nice size border of wood chips or stones, it'll help between the wooded area or between your shrubs, etc., and your lawn. It's not going to stop it totally, but it's a big help. Also, somebody asked about the tick boxes. Are they okay for birds? My understanding is that the tick box and the tick protection system, these are two different kinds, are safe for birds that just can't get in.
And I'd like to answer this question about pollinator plants and shrubs that grow well in shade. A quick rundown would be native ferns. Creating a native fern garden, there are so many beautiful choices. having a really mixed, rich bed of that. Wild ginger is a great ground cover. It's something that I usually recommend instead of Pachysandra, which is common but invasive. Actea racemosa, which is black cohosh. Sorry. Black cohosh is also another good one. Carex, a native sedge, is also really wonderful. It's sometimes also used instead of grass. Grows to about 4 inches, can sometimes have tiny flowers. Really good for dry shade. Euchera, wild geranium, mayflower, Jacob's ladder, Aquilegia, which is columbine. All of those would be nice flowering plants. A lot of those shade plants tend to flower in the spring. There are not a lot of choices for like late season shade flowering plants. They tend to be more spring ephemerals.
That's true.
Anybody else have any questions?
Perhaps also, I just wanted to add, Crystal, and I don't know if that's something in the works, but we could have further workshops that go deeper into the choices of plants and helping people with that.
Be happy to put on another workshop if that's something people are interested in. I understand we threw a lot of information at you today.
Yeah.
So it's past an hour. We don't want to keep you too long because it's Saturday morning. When I send out the list of resources, I will include a contact email. You can always reach out to us if you have any questions, and I will share the recording with you and a bunch of resources to help you get started.
I have one more thing to say. I just see M. Kelly putting a last plug-in on, excuse me, the DOTs and the Finger Lakes cutting down every along the roadside, spraying and cutting everything to in the fall. And so there's a lot of work to be done with the DOTs to help them have more sustainable practices. I know that in our area, and I can't remember, I just read an article about this, but one of the DOTs is actually doing the right thing. So yes, that's an area that needs a lot of approaching and a lot of outreach and a lot of education.
I have a question.
Hi, Peter.
I bought this package of Northeast Pollinator American Meadows wildflowers and sowed them in the fall after the frost had started. And the warning is it'll be a hard time getting started and you'll get a lot of weeds. So I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with that because I've got a large area and so I can't get in there and hand pull the weeds. And also the stilt grass is growing like crazy around here.
Yep.
So the stilt grass is going to probably outgrow my wildflowers like 10 to 1. So it seems maybe this is not a very practical way to do it. Any comments?
It does have, it is intensive in the beginning until it gets established, and after that it's a breeze. After that it's mow once a year, but definitely it is I would say the first 2 maybe 3 years you will have to be hand pulling weeds or periodically mowing. Am I wrong about that? You might have to mow it to keep the weed suppression down.
It depends on what it is,
Yeah.
what the plants are, if mowing works. I usually discourage sowing lots of mixed seeds, just because unless you know your plants really well and you know them at all stages, it's really hard to identify what is a weed and what's not. And as you're pulling weeds, you are also disturbing the soil microbes, and you're bringing up the weed seeds that are also already in the soil to the surface. So it's challenging. Maybe a smaller project starting with plugs might be more effective, or growing seeds inside and then transplanting them outdoors so that you know, and then you mark the plants so that you know like what you put where and what is a weed and what's not, because it can be really hard to ID it.
Yeah, I really concur with that. It's
Thank
not
you.
an easy thing. And a lot of these seeds need stratification, which means that they need to have periods of intense cold as well as warm ups and then cold again, etc., to be germinating. So depending on when you've sown them or you intend to sow them, they may or may not germinate. So sometimes it's good to let them out, like right now, put them into a box, something that you can cover with little holes in it, and let them grow on their own and see what comes up. Because we're still gonna have some cold, and just let it do what it wants, and then you'll have somewhat of an answer.
I'm definitely going to put a plug for plugs, because that is the first time I intentionally did a planting, a like well thought out planting in conjunction with someone else. And then in the slides past, I think I had showed what I had done. Let me see if I can go back to it. But I had basically mulched my backyard, that section, and then I put plugs right into, yeah, if you see that one, no, you don't want to see me. Okay. So if you see this, I mulched that section, and then I put about 170 plugs, and this is what I got the first year of growth. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what it looks like this year. But so in 1 year, it put in quite a bit of growth, just from like a little plug like this. So
I'm not familiar with the term plug.
It just means immature plant.
Yeah.
It's a seedling, basically. It's a seedling plant that has typically like a 4 to 5 inch root on it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And you can usually, if Pam had suggested, there are some places where if you can mix and match, which is kind of nice, you can design, maybe you get like several plants and then you put them in, and then it just takes off from there. And then I'm a huge fan of heavily mulching for weed suppression and water retention. So, and the good news is a lot of landscapers will just drop off wood chips for like really low or not,
Free.
or free.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One thing also you can do in order to suppress, and I'm sure Pam, please chime in on this. But I think planting like 1 plant per square foot is usually a good idea. It might turn out to be too much, but then you can always transplant them. But this is one way of crowding out the weeds, because you're really putting an effort in putting the plants that you want. And they fill out, they take all of the, as they grow, they take all of the light and they shade the weeds.
Well, I don't want to keep anyone longer unless you have burning questions. I'm really hope that you learned something, and we thank you for coming out this morning. Do I have? Oh.
And thank you so much for joining us and listening.
Thank you for doing it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Very
everybody.
informative and helpful.
This is just the beginning.
Be on the lookout for some resources, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday. And just to reiterate what Catherine said, if you have plants growing like that you left over winter, don't cut them down yet. Don't do your garden cleanup yet. You got to wait. I think it has to be 50 degrees.
60.
Is it 60? I thought it was 50.
60.
Okay, but definitely not you gotta wait at least at least a few more weeks before you start going in there and chopping down the plants. All
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
right,
Enjoy the weekend. Bye.
Okay,
Take care.
bye.
Bye.